Before the silence, there were bells. They rang across Europe's valleys and stone cities, calling farmers from fields and merchants from markets. They marked births, marriages, harvests. They stitched time together. In the early 14th century, Europe was alive, crowded, devout, restless. No one knew that soon those same bells would toll without pause, counting the dead. What happens to a civilization when half of it disappears? What remains when the living can no longer bury the fallen? This is the story of the Black Death, and how one plague did not merely kill millions, it reshaped the world. In the early 1300s, Europe was already strained. The medieval warm period had ended. Harvests faltered in colder, wetter years. Famine swept the land between 13 and 317. Villages clung to survival. Yet despite hardship, life pulsed forward. In cities like Florence and Paris, narrow streets buzzed with traders, priests and apprentices. Cathedral towers pierced the sky, monuments to faith. Most people lived short lives, bound to land owned by nobles. Serfs plowed fields from dawn until dusk, their world defined by soil and seasons. God explained everything: storms, disease, misfortune. The church was not just an institution. It was the architecture of reality. Far beyond Europe, however, a microscopic traveler was stirring. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on black rats, moved along the arteries of global trade. It traveled the Silk Road from Asia, hitching rides in grain sacks and cargo holds. In 1347, ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Sailors staggered ashore with black swellings under their arms and along their necks, buboes. Within days, they were dead. The disease moved faster than fear. From Italy, it spread to France, Spain, England. By 1348, it reached London. Chroniclers described carts piled high with corpses. Entire households vanished in a week. Some towns lost 70% of their population. Across Europe, an estimated 25 to 50 million people died in just 4 years. Perhaps half the continent. This was not a war. There were no battle lines. The enemy was invisible. Inside a peasant's cottage, a mother watches her child develop a fever. Black spots bloom across his skin. By morning, he cannot breathe. In a monastery, monks pray over one another until only one remains alive. In a manor house, a lord seals his gates, but the rats are already inside. The social order began to fracture. Fields went untilled. Livestock wandered untended. With labor scarce, surviving peasants realized something extraordinary. They were suddenly valuable. For centuries, feudalism had locked people into rigid hierarchies. Now, with entire villages erased, landlords competed for workers. Wages rose. In England, when authorities tried to freeze wages through the Statute of Laborers, in 1351, resentment simmered. It would erupt decades later in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when common people demanded dignity. The church, too, faced crisis. Priests died administering last rites. Some fled. Faith faltered. If God controlled the world, why would he allow such suffering? Flagellant movements marched through towns, whipping themselves in public penance. Others turned their grief outward, scapegoating minorities, especially Jewish communities, leading to massacres across German territories. Yet amid horror, transformation accelerated. Cities shrank but reorganized. With fewer mouths to feed, diets improved. Meat became more common. Survivors inherited land and wealth. A new middle class began to form. Labor-saving innovations spread. Water mills, windmills, improved tools. Scarcity bred efficiency. Art changed too. In the decades after the plague, painters obsessed over death, skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike. The dance macabre reminded viewers that mortality spared no one. But it also planted seeds of humanism. If life was fragile, perhaps it should be lived boldly. In cities like Florence, this mindset would help ignite the Renaissance. Globally, the plague altered trade routes and political power. The Mongol Empire fractured. Mediterranean commerce contracted, then adapted. Quarantine practices emerged in port cities like Venice, 40 days of isolation for arriving ships. It was an early attempt at public health, born from catastrophe. Resistance took many forms. Some communities organized sanitation measures. Others rewrote laws. Intellectual currents shifted subtly but decisively. Authority could no longer claim divine certainty without question. By the 15th century, Europe was not the same continent that had entered the plague. Population recovery took over a century, but society had been reset. Feudal bonds loosened. Economic mobility increased. Urbanization accelerated. The shockwave of mass death had cleared space, brutally, for a different future. And its legacy lingers. Modern labor rights, public health systems, quarantine protocols, their roots trace back to this medieval trauma. The idea that workers have leverage when labor is scarce. The recognition that disease can reshape geopolitics. The understanding that progress often emerges from collapse. The Black Death was not just a pandemic. It was a reckoning. It revealed the fragility of systems once thought eternal. It exposed cruelty and compassion in equal measure. It dismantled old hierarchies and fertilized new ideas. When the bells finally stopped ringing, Europe stood in a quieter world, scarred, smaller but transformed. Half of it was gone. And yet from that absence, something new began to grow. Because history does not end in the graveyard. It waits in the silence that follows. History doesn't disappear, it is reborn. The first wave did not end the nightmare. It only taught Europe how fragile breath could be. By the early 1350s, the worst seemed over. The dead were buried in mass graves beyond city walls. Grass began to reclaim abandoned fields. In places like London and Florence, markets reopened cautiously. Survivors stepped back into sunlight that felt unfamiliar, as though the world itself had shifted slightly on its axis. But something deeper had changed, and not just in numbers, but in consciousness. Before the plague, life had been collective. Villages worked as one organism, bound by obligation and tradition. Now emptiness haunted every space. A blacksmith inherited 3 forges because no rivals remained. A farm boy found himself master of land that once belonged to a noble family extinguished in a single winter. Wealth flowed upward and sideways. In England, laborers began demanding higher wages. They could walk away from unfair lords. There were too many empty manors. The ruling class responded with panic. In 1351, the crown attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But laws cannot command hunger or desperation. Across the countryside, quiet defiance simmered. A young plowman in Kent, no older than 20, now earns twice what his father once did. He tastes meat regularly for the first time in his life. He dares to imagine that his children might not bow as deeply as he did. This subtle shift, this whisper of agency, was revolutionary. Meanwhile, in the cities, guilds tightened their grip. With fewer craftsmen, skilled labor became power. Apprentices demanded shorter terms. Women, widowed in staggering numbers, stepped into workshops and businesses once closed to them. Some ran breweries, others managed estates. Though many would later be pushed back into narrower roles, the shock of necessity had briefly widened the boundaries of possibility, and yet prosperity did not come without shadow. Fields left uncultivated turned wild. In Eastern Europe, rather than loosening feudal bonds, landowners did the opposite. In regions of Poland and parts of the German states, surviving peasants were locked more tightly into serfdom. Labor was scarce, and elites were determined not to lose control. The plague had split Europe's trajectory, westward toward mobility, eastward toward constraint. Trade routes too adapted. Ports like Venice and Genoa learned to live with risk. Quarantine stations, 40 days of isolation for ships, became institutionalized. It was not perfect science. They did not know about bacteria, but they understood patterns. Isolation slowed contagion. Observation mattered. Out of catastrophe, bureaucracy emerged. Tax records grew more detailed. Governments counted people more carefully because now population was power. The state began to watch its citizens in new ways, to measure labor, land, and loss. Crisis demanded administration, but perhaps the deepest rupture was spiritual. The authority of the church had been shaken. Priests had died in droves. Some parishes were left without clergy for months. In certain towns, desperate communities appointed untrained men to conduct mass. Faith did not vanish. It intensified, fractured, mutated. Movements of radical piety surged. Flagellants marched again, whipping themselves in repentance. believing the plague to be divine punishment. Mystics wrote of visions and revelations, and ordinary believers began asking dangerous questions. If suffering could not be prevented by prayer, what did that mean about divine order? In the decades that followed, these doubts would simmer beneath Europe's surface. They would not erupt fully until the Reformation centuries later, but the seed had been planted in plague soil. Culturally, death became intimate. It was no longer distant or ceremonial. It was familiar. Artists painted skeletal figures leading kings and peasants alike in grim procession. The dance of death appeared on chapel walls from France to Germany, a grim reminder that hierarchy dissolves in the grave. Literature changed tone. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence, framed stories within its shadow. Young nobles fleeing the city, telling tales to distract themselves from mortality. The Renaissance did not emerge solely because of the Black Death, but the plague cleared space for it. With wealth redistributed and labor valued differently, patronage systems shifted. Human life, suddenly fragile and precious, became worthy of study in its own right. Curiosity expanded, and still the disease returned. The Black Death was not a single event. It revisited Europe in waves for centuries. Each recurrence reopened wounds, reminding people that recovery was temporary. Entire generations grew up expecting plague as a fact of life. A mother in Paris hears rumors of infection in the south. She stores grain early. A merchant in Venice checks ships more carefully. Fear becomes cyclical, seasonal. Europe had entered a new psychological age, one where uncertainty was permanent. Yet from this instability came resilience. Institutions hardened. Medical universities expanded their study of anatomy. Urban planning slowly improved. Sewers, waste disposal, spacing between homes. Incremental changes born from collective trauma. The old medieval world, with its rigid certainty and unquestioned hierarchies, had cracked. In its place emerged something less stable but more dynamic. A society forced to confront mortality had become restless, inventive, skeptical, ambitious. Half of Europe had died, but the survivors were not the same people who had once lived under cathedral shadows, trusting in eternal order. They had seen the order break. And once a civilization sees that its foundations can crumble, it begins, slowly, unevenly, to rebuild them differently. The plague did not simply end lives, it altered expectations. And in that altered expectation, a new Europe was taking shape. The generations born after the first Great Dying did not remember the world before it. To them, the Black Death was not an event. It was an inheritance. Grandparents spoke of villages erased in a season, of carts rattling through midnight streets, of priests collapsing beside the very bedsides they had come to bless. But for the young, the plague was a shadow that moved in cycles, a distant thunder that might one day roll back over the hills. And it did. In the 1360s, then again in the 1370s and 1380s, the disease returned. Smaller waves, fewer dead, but enough to reopen fear. Europe never fully escaped it. For 3 centuries, plague would revisit the continent like an unwelcome creditor, collecting its due. But Europe was no longer defenseless in the same way. In port cities such as Venice and Marseille, health boards were established. Officials inspected ships. Bills of health were demanded from captains. Lazarettos, quarantine islands, stood guard at harbor entrances. 40 days of waiting, watching, hoping. It was not modern epidemiology. They still blamed bad air, miasma, drifting invisibly through streets. Yet observation had replaced blind superstition. Patterns were tracked, records kept. The state had learned that disease was not merely spiritual, it was logistical. This shift mattered. Governments grew stronger in response to plague. To enforce quarantines, to regulate markets, to prevent panic, authority expanded. Public health became a justification for centralized power. In some regions, this meant stability. In others, repression. In England, labor tensions reached breaking point. The peasants' revolt of 1381 erupted not simply because of taxes, but because plague had altered expectations. Survivors believed their labor was worth more. When officials attempted to restore pre-plague hierarchies, resentment ignited. For a brief moment, rebels marched on London, demanding reform. The revolt was crushed, its leaders executed. Yet the message lingered. The old feudal order could not be perfectly restored. Across Western Europe, serfdom slowly declined. Landlords increasingly rented land for money rather than labor. Markets expanded. Mobility increased. A peasant's son might become a merchant. A merchant's daughter might marry into minor nobility. The rigid ladder of medieval life began to loosen. But not everywhere. In Eastern Europe, the opposite occurred. Nobles tightened control over peasants to compensate for population loss. The second serfdom took hold in regions of Poland and Hungary. The same plague that liberated some bound others more tightly. History rarely transforms evenly. Culturally, Europe's imagination darkened and deepened. Art did not look away from death. It studied it. Skeletons appeared in manuscripts. Hourglasses hovered over kings and beggars alike. The dance of death murals reminded viewers that mortality was the great equalizer. Yet alongside this fascination with decay came a renewed focus on the human form, its beauty, its complexity. In cities like Florence, patronage flowed toward artists and scholars. Wealth inherited from plague victims funded workshops and libraries. The trauma of mass mortality had sharpened a question. If life is fleeting, what is worth leaving behind? This question fueled the Renaissance. Humanism, the study of classical texts, the celebration of human potential, did not arise from plague alone. But the demographic shock created space. Fewer people meant more resources per survivor. Education became accessible to broader segments of society. Innovation accelerated. The Black Death also reshaped Europe's relationship with the wider world. Trade routes shifted. The decline of certain overland connections after the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire altered the balance of commerce. Maritime powers invested more heavily in sea routes. Curiosity about distant markets intensified. By the late 15th century, European explorers were probing the Atlantic. When ships sponsored by the crowns of Iberia sailed west and south, they carried with them lessons learned from centuries of plague. Quarantine, documentation, maritime discipline. The age of exploration cannot be traced solely to disease. Yet the restructured economies and empowered merchant classes of post-plague, Europe helped finance it. The ripple effects extended beyond economics. Communities traumatized by plague searched for explanations. Sometimes that search turned violent. Jewish communities, already marginalized, were falsely accused of poisoning wells during the first outbreak. Pogroms spread across parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Fear seeks targets. Yet alongside persecution emerged empathy. In some cities, hospitals expanded. Charitable institutions grew more organized. Brotherhoods and guilds created funds for widows and orphans. Society learned, imperfectly, to care for collective vulnerability. By the 17th century, the Great Plague outbreaks began to subside in Western Europe. The reasons were complex: improved sanitation, changing rat populations, evolving immunity. When the Great Plague struck London in 1665, killing tens of thousands, it felt like an echo from a distant century. And then gradually the echo faded. But its imprint remained. Modern public health systems trace their ancestry to plague boards. Labor markets still operate on principles sharpened by demographic shock. The weakening of feudalism, the strengthening of centralized states, the cultural shift toward human-centered inquiry, all were accelerated by catastrophe. The Black Death was not merely a medieval tragedy. It was a crucible. It revealed the fragility of institutions once thought eternal. It redistributed power without asking permission. It forced Europe to confront mortality not as an abstraction, but as a neighbor. In the silence after the bells stopped, something restless stirred. A continent that had faced extinction began to imagine reinvention. And in that uneasy space between terror and possibility, the foundations of the modern world were laid, not by design, but by survival. Because when half of a civilization vanishes, the other half must decide what kind of world it wishes to rebuild. History does not disappear in the ashes of plague. It waits. And then it begins again. By the time Europe finally stepped out from under the long shadow of plague, it was no longer medieval in spirit. The cathedrals still stood. The bells still rang. But the certainty that once filled those stones had thinned. The Black Death had done more than thin the population. It had thinned illusions. In the centuries that followed, Europe entered an age of acceleration. Trade networks widened. Banking families rose to prominence. In cities like Florence, merchant dynasties funded art and architecture that celebrated not just God, but humanity itself. The Renaissance bloomed, not in denial of death, but in response to it. If life could vanish overnight, then it must be studied. Painted, sculpted, understood. Anatomy advanced because artists wanted to capture muscle and bone precisely. Universities expanded their medical faculties because rulers feared the return of invisible killers. Records were kept more carefully. Births, deaths, property, taxes. A new obsession with measurement took hold. To count was to control. To observe was to survive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Europe's relationship with authority changed. The church never disappeared. Faith endured, but unquestioned obedience weakened. When reformers later challenged ecclesiastical power, they did so in a world already accustomed to doubt. The plague had proven that institutions could fail, that priests could die. That divine order, as explained by men, might not be so orderly. The psychological rupture mattered as much as the demographic one. Even the landscape bore scars of transformation. Forests reclaimed abandoned farmland in the decades after the first outbreak. With fewer humans burning wood and cultivating soil, carbon levels subtly shifted. Some historians argue that the depopulation even contributed to a slight global cooling, a reminder that humanity and environment are entwined. The plague had not only killed people, it had altered ecosystems. Beyond Europe, its shockwaves reshaped empires. Trade through Central Asia faltered with the fragmentation of Mongol authority. Mediterranean powers recalibrated their strategies. In the Ottoman realms, recurring plague shaped urban governance and medical practice for centuries. Disease became a constant political consideration. By the time Europeans began crossing oceans in the 15th and 16th centuries, they carried more than ambition. They carried microbes. The grim irony is unavoidable. A continent forged in the trauma of plague would later transmit devastating diseases to the Americas, where indigenous populations lacking immunity suffered catastrophic loss. The Black Death had been a teacher, but its lessons were not always used with compassion. Within Europe, memory of the Great Dying lingered in stories and superstition. In rural villages, elders warned children about bad air rising from marshes. In port cities, yellow flags still signaled quarantine. Even centuries later, the word plague carried an almost mythic dread. Yet humanity adapts. Medical science advanced unevenly but persistently. By the 18th century, scientific inquiry was beginning to challenge ancient theories of miasma. Eventually, the discovery of bacteria would reveal the true culprit, Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas on rats. The invisible enemy finally had a name. But knowing the name did not erase the past. Walk today through the narrow lanes of Prague or Venice and you will find plague columns, Baroque, monuments erected in gratitude for deliverance. Angels stand atop them, triumphant over suffering. They are beautiful. They are solemn. They are reminders. The Black Death forced Europe into confrontation with three truths. First, that progress is fragile. Second, that power can shift overnight. And third, that catastrophe can accelerate change in ways no ruler could orchestrate. Half of Europe died between 1347 and 1351. Entire bloodlines ended. Languages disappeared from certain valleys. Songs were forgotten. Knowledge was lost with the dead. And yet, from that vacuum emerged a different balance of power, one that weakened feudal bonds, strengthened cities, and nudged Europe toward modernity. This is the paradox at the heart of the plague. It was unspeakably cruel. It unleashed persecution and panic. It deepened inequality in some regions, even as it loosened it in others. It shattered faith for some and intensified it for others. But it also redistributed opportunity. It forced innovation. It compelled societies to rethink labor, health, governance, and the value of a single human life. Standing in our own age, an age that has again felt the tremor of global disease, the story of the Black Death feels less distant. We recognize the fear, the uncertainty, the way empty streets can silence a city once thought unstoppable. The medieval world believed itself permanent. Then the ships arrived. Then the bells began to ring. When they finally stopped, Europe was smaller, but it was not the same. The plague did not ask permission to transform civilization. It did not negotiate. It did not distinguish between king and cobbler. It erased, and in that erasure it cleared ground. History rarely moves gently. More often it convulses, it tears. It burns away what seems immovable. The Black Death was one of those convulsions, a dark hinge on which Europe turned from medieval rigidity toward restless reinvention. The bones of the old world lie beneath modern streets, and every time we confront uncertainty, every time we rebuild after loss, we echo that distant century, because history does not disappear. It waits beneath the surface of our lives, quiet and patient, and when the moment comes, it is reborn.